Streaming. Okay, it looks as if we are streaming and in general available. Okay, start our music. Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher, webcasting from my ITV studio here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yesterday we talked a lot about different models or positions or ideas about the problem of free will on Tuesday, our Free Will Day. But today is a day of talking about a philosopher. And I've chosen for my philosopher one whom I almost included in my book on free will. My free will book actually had 4 philosophers that I chose as typical of major positions. One is the great Dan Dennett, who was representative of compatibilism. Bob Kane was a kind of representative libertarian who defends for free will, although a close examination shows that he mostly is still thinking about moral responsibility, what he calls ultimate responsibility. The determinist that I chose to represent his position was Ted Honderich of England and past chairman of the Institute for Philosophy that had been founded by Bertrand Russell, so a very prominent Englishman who wrote very emotionally, deeply feeling the question of determinism as something that was regrettable. He called it a black thing, but nevertheless chose to believe that determinism is the condition that we find ourselves in because of the laws of physics being deterministic. Now, you know, I think that the laws of physics at the basic level, the microscopic level, are not deterministic. So I argue for a little bit of indeterminism, and that opens the way to alternative possibilities for our action. Since William James in the 1880s first enunciated the notion that new ideas might pop into our head and we might follow them even though we don't know where they come from. And that provides the possibility for a 2-stage model of free will, which is the fundamental point of this book. Although I cover the whole history of all the positions in free will, which we discussed yesterday, and hundreds, well, at least many dozens of philosophers with positions on free will through the ages. Well, today, I've chosen John Martin Fischer for his position, which I almost included in the free will book, because he has this position that's held quite widely throughout the philosophical community today, more than almost any other single position. And this is the idea that began back with Peter Strawson. Sir Peter argued that whether or not free will is true, that is to say, there is real freedom in our thoughts, freedom in our actions, and whether determinism is true, which I think he accepts would mean there is no freedom in our action, and that freedom and free will is simply an illusion. Sir Peter basically said, I don't understand either of these positions of free will, determinism. He couldn't quite get into that as an analytic language philosopher, but he did say that whether or not the one or the other of this dichotomy between freedom and determinism is true, using the kind of terminology and way of speaking that philosophers do, as compared to scientists who like to say, well, we're not talking about logically true, we're talking about empirically the case. That is to say, there's evidence for a position. Philosophers, of course, prefer problems that they think they can reconcile by arguing the two sides, or many sides, if there are more than one possibility, and then homing in on one by reason of their argument, their discussion, and so forth. I like to say philosophers prefer problems because they like to teach those problems in their classes. And they like to, I think, defend a position so that they occupy a little niche in the spectrum of all possible positions, and thereby improve their academic status, their ability to publish in their narrow area, in contrast to all the other positions that might be out there in the field, which we saw yesterday. So let me bring up the story yesterday about the taxonomy of multiple positions. I'll just scroll today's blog post on John Martin Fischer and compatibilism. We scroll down a little bit, we get to yesterday, when I argued there were many philosophical positions on the free will problem. And I tried to just distinguish them all from one another and give them their names and point to my taxonomy, which is on my website. And that taxonomy looks like this. And we see in the middle of all of this a position called semi-compatibilism. And that is originally, I believe, not named, but argued for at least since Peter Strawson. And what he's saying, basically, is that free will may not be compatible with determinism, or it may be incompatible with determinism, but that is not of interest either to Sir Peter Strawson or to John Martin Fischer, because what he wants and what he feels he needs is that there is a compatibilism of determinism with moral responsibility. Now, quite a few people hold this position, although it's definitely a controversial one, since intuitively it seems as everything is following laws of physics and we are all just the products of atoms in our molecules, in our cells, coming up from the biological basis of our bodies and eventually leading to a causal chain, which in turn decides what I'm about to say next. But despite this common sense position, philosophers seem to like the idea, and it has a variety of names, which we'll look at a little bit more. I guess we'll see a couple of them here. A kind of narrow incompatibilism, people say. That's Randolph Clarke's position, I believe. And the notion is that, well, there's an incompatibilism with free will, between free will and determinism, but there's not a compatibilism between moral responsibility and determinism. Now, this is argued widely. Perhaps the most famous compatibilist, who calls himself a compatibilist, who on close inspection may be in fact following the ideas of John Martin Fischer. Studying Fischer was a great job for me. He's a very prolific writer, and he has a large school of followers. I think in the dozens of younger philosophers who got their degrees either at Riverside University in California or neighboring schools, second generation people teaching Fischer's ideas, teaching Strawson's ideas, and some going all the way back to David Hume, because there's an argument along the lines of Hume's skeptical position relative to free will might not apply to whether we have what Hume called the moral sentiments. So there's a lot to be understood here. So I'm going to give you mostly the current status of the work of Fischer, but there's a long backstory going all the way back, at least I think to Strawson certainly, and probably to David Hume, and the important notions that David Hume and Adam Smith both wrote about, that human beings have a kind of sentiment, a feeling about what's good and a feeling about what's bad. And Smith and Hume, with their Enlightenment views and empirical views, were arguing that these were useful to consider as important properties of being human, and today the fact that they're challenged by people who think we are reducible to computers or reducible to machines, which has been a long tradition in philosophy. After Newton's physics seemed to be so powerful, could explain absolutely everything. The planets go perfectly around the sun. We can predict their positions exactly. We can fly men to the moon and back using all of these laws of physics. And the argument goes along the lines that says, if these laws of physics explain absolutely everything in the universe and they're completely deterministic, how could we in our minds escape those deterministic laws of nature? Surely we would be asking for a kind of miracle. And there are those who think, or who've spoken, published, on the idea that free will is a kind of miracle, a gift of God. Some religions claim that we have been given this gift, and that is enough for them to say that we are free. In the area of Christian religions, that's the position of the Catholic Church, for example. On the other hand, Protestantism, going back to Luther, has the view that that there is no free will, that everything's determined because of God's omniscience, and as a consequence, some people are already what's called elect, have been chosen. They are the chosen people, a phrase that goes way back to early Judaism and even current Judaism to some extent. Those who believe that Yahweh or a God, one of the early monotheistic gods. Actually, there are others, especially going back to Zoroastrianism or Zarathustra, maybe as much as 2 millennia before the Common Era. Nevertheless, this idea that we have an omniscient being does tend to put you into the position of saying, well, if God knows the future completely, it's called foreknowledge, the challenge of the problem of foreknowledge, of knowing something ahead of time about what's going to happen tomorrow, does tend to put us in a position of thinking, well, we don't have anything to do with it. It's all just like a movie playing, and all the parts are ready to come as soon as the future rolls through the movie projector and we actually see what we're going to do tomorrow, what we're going to think tomorrow, and so forth. Well, that is a very strong position, and perhaps the most famous compatibilist that I wrote about in my book is Daniel Dennett. And when you look closely at what Dennett is saying, he doesn't really require, he does in fact say that he's basically a determinist, and what he thinks is useful in a deterministic world is that we can make changes of kinds. We can choose between different possibilities. In his 1978 book, Brainstorms, he gave an idea to libertarians that said, why don't we think about a model in which you can have multiple things to choose between, which was popular in those days in the work of Herbert Simon and Alan Newell with their general problem solver. And others had been proposing something similar. I believe that Dan Dennett saw much of that and put it into this proposal, which he himself did not want to accept the idea that the generation of alternative possibilities, he did not know the term, I think, from William James yet, something I discovered a bit of time after I read the Dan Dennett book and was thinking along the same lines. It turns out to be that William James was thinking. So Dennett didn't use the term alternative possibilities, but he did talk about the stage in which possibilities generate is an early stage. And that's, he says, the place to have indeterminism, if there is a place for indeterminism in the world, according to Dan Dennett. And Dan today has to admit, he does admit that quantum mechanics does provide a kind of randomness, and that randomness could generate new possibilities, but he says we don't need that. We don't need that much. It's enough to have a kind of computer mind, a computational mind, which can generate pseudo-random possibilities. That's a subtlety that I can't follow for the reason that I say simply, why would evolution have evolved a complex pseudo-random number generator in the brain so as to provide Dan Dennett's kind of possibilities when we already have quantum noise in information that's stored in these tiny little structures, information structures that are part of our neurons in the neocortex and so forth. So quantum effects are definitely real in the human and in most animals, all the way from the smallest animals, are sensitive to quantum randomness because the human living things have evolved right to the quantum limit. Now, this is an important piece of my argument for why we should be thought of as involving microscopic quantum mechanical effects, some of which would lead to noise, it's called, in the information. That would lead us to think about something, and we might accidentally think about something else because the signals coming back being recalled from our experience recorder may not be exactly what were stored earlier. Or indeed, when experiences were stored, maybe they were stored incorrectly, and we have a wrong idea about something in our brains, but it turns out that that wrong idea can be very useful in certain circumstances, and we go out and choose this different new idea. Turns out we're being creative, and we've perhaps brought something into the world of knowledge which wasn't there before, and so forth. So my story is dependent on quantum randomness at the lowest level, and it leads to the possibility of new information generated that did not exist in the universe before, and that's my whole story of coming from the early creation of the elementary particles, then the creation of the galaxies, stars, and planets, through to the origin of life on Earth, where previously all information structures like galaxies, stars, and planets had been produced by forces, which are simply natural forces doing their thing, like gravity when the planets and galaxies form, and nuclear forces when the elementary particles combine to become atoms and so forth. Actually, nuclear forces when we produce the nucleons, protons, and neutrons, and then electromagnetic or electrodynamic or static forces between electrons and the nuclear particles to form our atoms and our molecules, which are formed under electrical forces along with quantum requirements that allow structures to follow the laws of quantum mechanics. Okay, so background to all of this is that Dennett is a kind of semi-compatibilist, something like John Martin Fischer. Although I don't think he would think of himself as that, I do believe that the fourth philosopher that I put in my book on free will, Alfred Mealy, may well be a semi-compatibilist. I thought I might take a look into my chapter on Mealy, because there I find that, let's take a look at 6 here. Here we are in Alfred Mealy's modest libertarianism, he calls it. And it turns out that Mealy is very close to the position of John Martin Fischer. Let's take a brief zoom in on this. And I say, Mealy tells me, and I wrote this back in 2011, I'm just reminding myself of it this morning, that he and John Martin Fischer subscribe to the view that, quote, even if determinism were true, we would still have free will. Well, that's not the case. What it is we might have is moral responsibility. I should have written that at the time, but I say this can only be what Immanuel Kant calls the wretched subterfuge of, well, compatibilist free will. That wasn't a phrase of Kant's. But as I see it, this hypothesis derives from 2 sources. First, there is P.F. Strawson. and his view that whether determinism or indeterminism is true, we would not be willing to give up moral responsibility. Second, there is Fischer's view that free will is only the control condition for moral responsibility. So I think we could restate the hypothesis as, quote, even if determinism were true, we would still have moral responsibility. Determinism is not, quote, true. That's, you hear philosophers talking, and just to note that this is what I fight against in my subtitle for my work, where I say, we must get beyond logic and language. Logic and language are wonderful, wonderful tools, but they're only tools, and they don't get us to truths about the natural, or facts, I should say, about the natural world, and especially at the quantum level. So I can completely agree with this hypothesis, I say, and I can go further and formulate what might be called Strawson and me hypothesis that, quote, even if indeterminism is true, we still have both free will and moral responsibility, because for me, the randomness of quantum chance, ontological chance, is critical to breaking the causal chain that leads to the view that we're all just something where the things going on are happening to us, and that we are not making them happen. We are not the authors of our lives. So in my two-stage model, the indeterminism in the first stage doesn't prevent our will and our actions from being adequately determined by reasons, by motives, by feelings, etc., as compatibilists have always wanted. They really just wanted us to be adequately determined, not predetermined, as I describe it. So indeterminism in the first stage means that our actions were not predetermined from the moments just before we began to generate our alternative possibilities for our actions, let alone from before we were born or from the origin of the universe. And I like to say, thoughts come to us freely, actions go from us willfully. Because first we have chance, then we have choice. First free, then will, in this two-stage model of first a free stage, then a willed or adequately determined stage. So here in Mealy, Mealy has said that he more or less accepts or goes along with the arguments of John Martin Fischer. So let's come back to Fischer for just a moment. And let's see, I'm not sure, no, I don't need much more of that in the book. And let's talk a little bit more about the work of Fischer. First, this is a very important book in which here the argument for moral responsibility is simply that we have free will, or that we have moral responsibility. And it can't be denied, he says, it can't be denied just because we are determined. Now, of course, traditionally, those who worried about whether we would be moral responsibility have argued that if things are determined, then we're not responsible. And that sets up a large group of people who are basically the hard incompatibilists here in our picture. They think that the notion of free will and even moral responsibility is an illusion. Well, typically illusion is associated with who say no free will, no consciousness, it's just an illusion, and so forth. And the idea of impossibilism is associated with the idea that given that everything's determined and that's hard incompatible with free will, it's also incompatible with moral responsibility. And Galen Strawson, who's Sir Peter's son, and a very important, prominent philosopher today, he has written what he calls a basic argument, which, according to Galen Strawson, proves the impossibility of moral responsibility. He says there's a chain going back to the beginning of the universe where each event in that chain, each event is either determined by the prior event, in which case we have no freedom, and can't be responsible for something that was determined by forces outside of our control. Remember, we're talking about responsibility and control, and Galen Strawson is, forget it, we don't have any control. Or, says Galen Strawson, you go back to an event which was random, and he accepts the possibility that there are random events in the universe. But, says Galen Strawson, we can't possibly be responsible for something that was just happening by accident. Al Neely likes to put that in what he calls the problem of luck. If something we did was just because we luckily came into our minds a possibility that turned out to be a wonderful thing, surely we're not responsible for that. We can't claim to be responsible for something which was just pure luck, pure accident. Well, I disagree. There's plenty of luck in the universe, both good and bad. Plenty of times when something happens that just plain happens. As William James put it, things just pop into our minds. We have lots and lots of ideas, he thought, at a kind of subconscious level, as all of our experiences, in my terminology, are blooming and buzzing around inside our mind. Accidentally, occasionally we focus our attention on one of them, and it might be something that was an old event that we hadn't remembered correctly, and we suddenly bring out a new idea. Bernard Bahr's, I have a webpage on Bahr's work in what he calls the so-called theater of consciousness. In the theater of consciousness, ideas come to the stage, kind of director, the sort of front and center idea of a conscious thinker in our minds, and out in the audience of this on-stage manager of our conscious activities, there are lots and lots of people sitting in the theater who are much like what Dan Dennett describes as his little homunculi, tiny little beings who are specialists in all sorts of knowledge. And when a particular idea is maybe projected on a screen behind the stage manager of what we're thinking about, and this stage manager is sort of controlling the stream of consciousness, which William James describes as containing things we don't know exactly why. Some things come up from below, where there's a lot of people in the theater shouting, I know something about that, or I know something about this, I know more than you know, listen to me, and somehow attention is paid to the one thing that enters the stream of consciousness and goes forward. In the William James idea fits well with Bernard Bahr's idea, and with Newell and Simon had a model of conscious thinking process they called the blackboard model, because they imagine writing a word on the blackboard and it gets written on by incoming sensory experiences, brand new experiences. Incoming appears on the blackboard, and then the homunculi of Dan Dennett or the people sitting in the seats in the theater notice the new word on the blackboard, and they start shouting, I know something about that new word on the blackboard, let me take over the stream of consciousness. I find all three of those very compatible or comparable, interestingly combinable into a model of my own notion of the language, the stream of talking, or stream of ideas that are at our upper, very conscious level of what it is we're thinking and working on. Okay, so to come back to this notion of responsibility and control, I see, we'll take a little look into this book again, and this time it's the theory of moral responsibility. But inside, I find here, am I on my tightest position? Yes, I am. Fischer starts off with, we've implicitly been developing a view of moral responsibility that takes its cue from Peter Strawson's landmark essay, Freedom and Resentment. Strawson begins his argument by noting the, quote, the very great importance that we attach to the attitudes and intentions towards us of other human beings, and the great extent to which our personal feelings and reactions depend upon or involve our beliefs about these attitudes and intentions. So the notion here of attitudes and intentions is what is frequently called the reactive attitudes, that human beings just normally can react to incoming events, and when they see something bad in what's coming in, let me come back here, when they see something being done that is disturbing them, they can't prevent themselves from feeling that maybe some blame should be apportioned to those who are doing these bad things. When they see something good that's happening, then perhaps they should feel that those events are praiseworthy. And Strawson was taking that, I think, from the earlier position that we have these normal human sentiments, moral sentiments, and they are just a part of being a human being. Okay? So let's go back here and look at this a bit more. When we regard someone as a responsible agent, we are reacting to the person with a unique set of feelings and attitudes. For example, gratitude, indignation, resentment, love, respect, and forgiveness. Now that it was not, I passed a quote from Strawson, and that's Fischer talking. Strawson uses the term reactive attitudes to refer to this range of attitudes that, quote, belong to our involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships. So I think I'm convinced here that that Fischer is basically a modern development on the notions of Sir Peter Strawson. Now I'd like to show you another book of this very prolific writer. Let me back up a little bit so you can see the whole title of this one, Metaphysics of Free Will, John Martin Fischer. And there's a little section in here that I like because I was once following a website which students of John Martin Fischer created called Flickers of Freedom. And he says here he's presented 3 flickers of freedom strategies that start by taking a somewhat careful view of the alternative sequence and thereby generate an alternative possibility that might previously have gone unnoticed. So I've found in reading John Martin Fischer that he seems to agree with the notion of alternative possibilities. And I've included Fischer in my list of those who at least have considered the possibility of a James-style 2-stage model, where an alternative possibility comes up and then there's a selection between the alternative possibilities. I want to show you another little piece of Strawson's work. It's quite amazing. Let me switch over to my overhead camera again for a moment. And this one is not just one book. This is 4 books. See if I can see the spine of them easily. This is called Volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4 of Critical Concepts in Philosophy, Free Will. And it's an enormous collection. Each one of these books at the moment is very hard to find, or relatively hard to find, and they sell for a few $100s each. So that the set costs $1,400. And the only reason I have a set is because I can get them out of the Widener Library at Harvard University. You see these were published in 2005. And what they consist of is an enormous collection of articles by people in the field. It starts with, see if I've got a listing somewhere. So here's part 1, volume 1, Free Agency, Moral Responsibility, and Skepticism, and an article by Harry Frankfurt, who's very influential Princeton philosopher, Gary Watson, more Frankfurt, and more Gary Watson, and so forth. And so each one of these are selections taken out of very important writers. I really think this one is very important. Free Will Remains a Mystery by Peter Van Engwagen. And here is The Bounds of Freedom from Galen Strawson. We just talked about him. And Strawson and Saul Smilansky and Derek Perboom from Cornell, these three are all believe in it's impossible to have moral responsibility. So they're in a section, part 2, on worries about the coherence of free will and moral responsibility. So they are, both Smilansky and Strawson describe themselves as impossibilists on the question of moral responsibility. Hard incompatibilism, you see his notion is attached to Derek Perboom. So we can come back to hard incompatibilism here on our screen, and you see that those are handled in the first book of 4 produced by Fischer. Enormously valuable and a lot to read and a lot to, for me to take sections of the works of these different philosophers and put them on my web pages. So I can go over here for a minute to my information philosopher, expand this a little bit, show you what I'm doing. Basically, everyone you see on that book, in those books by John Martin Fischer, have all been included here. So I've got individual specific pages on all the people who represent different positions in this taxonomy of possible positions on free will. So let's go back and scroll up to my blog post for today. That was yesterday's discussion. There are so many philosophical positions. The one where I'm focusing on now is the work of John Martin Fischer. So he gave it this name, Semi-Compatibilism, and it's the idea that moral responsibility is compatible with determinism, whether free will is or is not compatible with determinism. Now, I find the concept is similar but not identical to the position of narrow incompatibilist, which says free will is incompatible with determinism, but moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. You could say, well, why isn't that exactly the same as what John Martin Fischer is saying? And it's amazing how these different philosophers around the country and around the world, Saul Smilansky is in Israel, Galen Strawson's an Englishman who comes to the U.S. sometimes, they are all slicing and dicing the possible positions they can take. So they all occupy these little niches, and it can be quite confusing. I spent quite a few years trying to deal with this because I thought I had a very sensible contribution to make to the problem of free will by arguing for random new ideas entering the universe. Those of you who've been listening to my lectures know that my entire picture of how we understand the natural world is to see it in terms of a universe that began with very little information. Basically chaos everywhere, super high temperatures, super high density, nothing remotely like the sort of thing that human beings are doing when they use logic and language and communicate and so forth. It was a sterile world with nothing that could be considered an information structure until the first elementary particles began to form. And then 380,000 years later, I could point out that the first atoms form. Now it's starting to be what Richard Feynman said. We should realize that the universe and everything in it is made up of atoms, with the exception, of course, energy, which are photons and not exactly matter. But it is the case that the early stage of my picture of the world is a stage in which matter is not only forming different forms, different information structures, it is being done entirely under the control of physical forces. So it's a really material world in the sense that some philosophers today think everything is material. Everything is explainable by forces working on those atoms and causing everything that we do to be explainable because they are reducible to physics. Their argument goes, well, chemistry is reducible to physics, and most chemists will accept that notion. Very little in chemistry is predictable directly from quantum physics, but everything in chemistry is consistent with quantum physics. And of course, thermodynamics, which is the second element in my explanation for how we get from an early moment in the universe to a later moment. Always, in order to get an information structure, it must be the case that when you make a new structure, it's containing information or it has relative negative entropy compared to the situation before it formed. And unless an excess of positive entropy, usually energy carried away out to the night sky or away from the new information structure, you cannot maintain that structure. So in the early universe, very early universe, when a structure formed, it was likely blown apart instantly, more or less instantly, by the radiation field or the collisions of all the other particles. It took a special condition to allow information structures to form, and that condition, as you hope to recall by now, is that the universe is expanding. And the expanding universe allows some material here and some there to separate apart from one another and give them room to arrange themselves and become something interesting in the form of a different information structure. And that continues to be true until life on Earth. When life forms on Earth, though, now the new information structures, the new generations of living things are using information in order to create the next generation. So now in the living phase of my picture of the universe in terms of information structures, we have active information structures under their own control to a great extent. They're still governed by physical laws, but in the earlier universe, there was nothing but physical laws creating the stars, the galaxies, and our planet. When we get to the living stage, now we have information, algorithms, the kind of information that's in our DNA, working and being processed and managing the putting together of individual information structures, like the arrangement of amino acids along a protein, along a polypeptide chain it's called. It's clearly a case of like an assembly line following a blueprint, following a kind of recipe for the production of another protein. Then when I get to the model of the mind, which is my third stage, I am going to argue that information is being created now out of information itself. Information itself is being rearranged in minds like ours, very distinctly different from forming a material structure. We now have an immaterial mind. And that was argued against for centuries, ever since Descartes proposed it, that the mind was immaterial and it could have difficulty in his view of, he didn't understand exactly how that immaterial substance, he called it a substance, while today we think of it more as something without material properties. So how can something immaterial push on an material body? We solve that today by allowing information to be in charge of what happens next, because it's being utilized by the material brain in a combination that allows the immaterial ideas to be acted upon, okay, by the rest of us. So I say that, coming back to John Martin Fischer as a person, we can make all these distinctions. I'll just go down again. Here's a view of just the determinist and compatibilist side of the diagram. And you see here I put semi-compatibilism down below compatibilism. But then we also have hard incompatibilism and as illusionism. This one is not quite as complete as my new taxonomy that I have in our lecture yesterday, so I'll go take a look at that one more time. And we see here is John Martin Fischer's semi-compatibilism, and then a narrow incompatibilism, and a broad incompatibilism would be that free will is just simply incompatible with determinism. But a narrow incompatibilism, and that's argued by Randolph Clarke, is that free will is incompatible with determinism, but moral responsibility is not, and that's the goal of Fischer's work. So let's come back up to the top. And what I've said already that the broad incompatibilists include, and this is very confusing, the term incompatibilism was developed by Peter Van Inwagen in his essay on free will, and he argued that this is the way we should think, although now we have incompatibilists on the free will business and incompatibilists on the moral responsibility business. It gets quite complicated and very difficult to be a student of philosophy of free will and determinism in the last few decades, because those who deny either free will or moral responsibility can be called a lot of things: hard incompatibilists, illusionists, impossibilists, and so forth, as you saw. So I just want to, here's a specific, clear statement by Fischer that I think proves the position I'm claiming that he holds. He says, quote, some philosophers, let's bring it full screen, some philosophers do not distinguish between freedom and moral responsibility. Put a bit more carefully, they tend to begin with the notion of moral responsibility and then work back to the notion of freedom. Now, this notion of freedom is not given independent content, separate from the analysis of moral responsibility. For such philosophers, quote, freedom refers to whatever conditions are involved in choosing or acting in such a way as to be morally responsible. In a way, this is, I mean, it's a wretched subterfuge. It's word juggling, as these critics of this idea that somehow we're free if we're morally responsible. For starters, who is to say what constitutes morally responsible actions? It's certainly not a question for science, which is what I bring to the problem of free will. What I bring is the possibility of having quantum ontological chance involved in breaking the causal chains from the past. Fischer seems not to be interested in that at all, although in one article he did write that his view of free will as moral responsibility would be something that would survive, even if he said in some decades in the future the New York Times should publish an article that indeterminism is true and that determinism is false. He says he would nevertheless, his model would still apply because he would think his free will is moral responsibility. And I must say I just can't quite go along with that idea for the simple reason that which moral responsibility is it that's compatible with determinism? We look around the planet, we have a lot of different cultures. They all have different attitudes about what constitutes moral behavior and immoral behavior. In modern times, the U.S., the Western world, has become quite lax, in a sense, loose, liberal, more free in the behavioral sense, political sense. We all now have, we are able to do things which we think are approve of things that are not being approved of in much of the rest of the world, which lives a more traditional set of beliefs. So you see the problem. If there are different forms of what constitutes moral in different groups of human beings, how is it that that John Martin Fischer can defend that as the thing we're going to call free? It seems to be very parochial. Now, I'm quite liberal. I live in Western society. I'm well educated and definitely do think that the freedom we have is a very special thing in the Western world, and I wish everyone could have it and enjoy it and so forth. But to say that the things we do in our lives are somehow absolute and should be described as free, that might go down well in some political circles, but it seems to me that it's basing our knowledge of our own ability to create new things on a cultural assessment of what constitutes free will, if we equate it with moral responsibility. And clearly Dan Dennett is in the same situation, because he wants people to be in his moral agent club or show moral competence, and that is an indication that that's a kind of free will worth wanting, he says in his book Freedom Evolved, and maybe also in Elbow Room. The free will worth wanting is one that makes us moral responsible persons. I find that hard to take, because, and maybe it's because people don't like my idea that there is a kind of absolute freedom, that we do have the ability to do whatever we want, which includes the ability to do things that do not comport with our society's idea of moral responsible behavior. This is a dilemma I face, I must admit. I'm thinking that the freedom we have in terms of what our brain can do in terms of embodying ideas that are maybe conflicting ideas, and maybe we choose one of them, which in retrospect we shouldn't have done that. But that was a free act. And if it's just because it's considered immoral or wrong, doesn't mean that we lack freedom. In fact, doing something totally opposed to our moral sensibility and our moral sentiments might be just one of those indications that tells us we are actually free, and we make mistakes and beyond. We actually, some of us, deliberately do things that are against our moral codes, and that must be something we just have to accept if we're trying to understand moral responsibility. For John Martin Fischer, whom we're talking about today, to say that that would not be free, because he is already saying that the problem of free will is just to defend moral responsibility, I hope you can see that we're in a bit of a dilemma with Fischer's thinking. So anyway, I point out that he's written several books, the 4-volume set here, which I showed you. And one interesting piece of work done by Fischer and his students and colleagues is, over the years, they created 2 very important blogs on free will and moral responsibility. And let's see if I can do this. Let's go to his original Garden of Forking Paths, and let's say it says open this link in a new tab. And let's see if that happens. I don't think so. Try it again. Hold it down, open the link in a new tab. Here it is. Here it is here. Now, I'm going to try to see if I can enlarge this to see when it was happening. This is March 30th, 2010. I think you can see that. And they wrote at this time, in case you've come here looking for a good discussion on free will and moral responsibility, only to be disappointed by the fact that this blog is now shut down, never fear, a new blog has arisen. Click here to visit Flickers of Freedom. So let me do that. I'll press on click here, and I'll open that one in a new tab. And I'm happy to show you, Agency and Responsibility Typepad is not found. Let me go back to my attempt to put a link up for Flickers of Freedom and see if that will succeed. And they've clearly got a new address. Now I have some lessons to discuss here with you. I am trying hard to assemble a lot of knowledge in the form of pages, web pages, and my own blog on great problems in philosophy, and I'm doing it in order to put it up there where it can be found in the future. What you just saw was when I went from the old Garden of Forking Paths website that was created by Fischer's students and linked forward to Flickers of Freedom, that link failed because they've changed the URL, they've changed the hyperlink reference, it's called, to their new blog. And that's called links rot. It's argued, it's maintained, I think, we learned that a large fraction of the web links, the pages behind those links, disappear. They're taken away about 20% per year. Of course, there's billions and billions of links, and you can say, so what's the loss? But that was the issue that Tim Berners-Lee brought up to me and my son Derek back in late 90s when he lamented the loss of interesting pages and information. And I now face the problem of how I will be able to maintain a persistent archive of all the web pages that I create and that might last even when I'm gone. I'm now 81, time is ticking for me. But at any rate, I wanted to give some credit to Fischer and his students for creating these two important blogs. Here we are on the new one called Flickers of Freedom, and now it's 2017, so let me bring this to full screen, and look how sad I am to read this page. As many of you know, this is Thomas Nadelhofer, the current administrator of the Flickers of Freedom blog. I have flirted on and off with shuttering. It should be shuttering rather than shuddering, I think, although he may also be shuddering, here at Flickers for some time now. Each time I publicly float the idea, there's a much appreciated stream of support from readers that slowly fades into the distance as the weeks and months creep by and inertia runs its inevitable course. So he basically is saying he's going to step away, and rather than trying to arrange for others to take the editorial reins, okay, he says, which I'm running from a single typepad account, I've decided it makes more sense to simply close the cyber doors. Well, to me, that's a great loss, although he at least keeps them as they are. So despite the fact that they changed the URL, and I wish I could go back to the Garden of Forking Paths original blog and fix that link. Unfortunately, I think they've frozen it and they've turned off the ability to keep it up to date, which is a problem. So I'm hoping to see some way for those blogs to come back and be usable again, because we need more discussion in our community, and I'm hoping to start some of that eventually, although it's a modest beginning. I'm on my 42nd, my 43rd lecture, and I only have a smaller number than that of people who are watching out there. You people, I appreciate your watching, I appreciate your commenting. And yesterday I spent a good deal of time trying to go through 120 some comments and reply to those that really deserve a reply from me as we go forward. Coming back to these two blogs, I'll tell you one more kind of odd story about them. The one called Garden of Forking Paths, here it is, the Garden of Forking Paths. I belong to that blog, so I wonder if, for example, there's still a search in this one. And I see a search, so let's put the search button down and say D-O-Y-L-E and search, see if this is still working. And it's not obviously working. Let's try it again, press search. Sorry, no results returned for Doyle. Please check your spelling. Well, that's rather sad. But I do wish we had a community of interested people that could be running a blog, either like the old Garden or the new Flickers, and look at the group of people who are on Flickers. Al Mealy, we've just been talking about. Let me bring this full screen. And lots of names you don't know. There's Derek Pereboom that we were talking about as one of the incompatibilists. Here's John Fischer himself. No one else here that we've been talking about, although I have web pages on most of these. Saul Smilansky, another person who is an incompatibilist and an impossibilist, okay? At any rate, what I'm thanking John Martin Fischer for is bringing into existence a community of inquirers who wanted to argue with one another. And initially, I was allowed in on his Garden of Forking Paths, but there came a time when they said, we really only ought to have professional philosophers. Partly that was because of people blogging and bringing up kind of arguments that didn't seem reasonable to be reasonable arguments to the organizers, and I can understand that. But they then asked me to leave, and the new Flickers of Freedom didn't include any flickers from yours truly. Okay, well, we're running out of time today. I think I'm going to just turn on a little of our background music and come to put up this page, which was our blog for today. And maybe I'll also put up, as the time runs out on us, our screen that I'm thinking of as our poster page. And I'll be saying goodbye and hope to see you next time. This was Philosophers and Scientists Wednesday. Tomorrow we turn to metaphysics. I thank you very much for being with us.